Ready for your weekly dose of brain gymnastics? Here, every opinion is a piece of the puzzle, and normal is just a setting on the dryer. We've only got one rule. All ideas are wrong ideas. Not because they're flawed, but because they offer a unique perspective worth exploring. So, if you keep an open mind and embrace the unconventional, you just might find that you've got the wrong idea.
Welcome back to another episode of the Wrong Idea podcast. I'm Jack, here with my brother Lucas.
Heyo,
How we doing?
doing great. How are you?
I'm doing good. Today, what are we diving into, my guy?
Well, today I think we've got the wrong idea about modern education.
Ah, yes, a classic, something that you and me discuss quite a lot in our free time.
Oh yeah, I mean, you know that this is a big one for me, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's something that you feel very passionate about.
Yeah, I have thought about this for years. I've done a lot of work in this area and a lot of thinking in general. So obviously, you're going to be familiar with these ideas, so you can help me convey them to the listeners here.
Oh, absolutely. As someone who's, in the midst of the education system, coming right up to the end of high school, I have active experience, which is different from your old experience.
Yeah, this is true. Our age gap is like 13 years or so.
I think that sounds about reasonable.
Yeah, so I've been out of the education system for a little while now, but that's why I'm actually glad you're still in there to give us the perspective of what's really going on still in the moment.
Right? Yeah, it's super cool. We get, sort of two different worlds converging because at the same time we have different perspectives, but there are teachers that you've had who still teach at the schools which I go to.
That's right. Well, I think my philosophy is sort of to go for a fundamentals first approach to things.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I'm always looking for that underlying principle that allows us to really understand what's going on at the deepest levels. I don't like having to keep too many things in my head at once or trying to explain things in too complex a way. I want to get to that one.
The one-liner.
Yeah, the simplest way to express a concept. So it took me a long time to get here. My take is basically this. Well, let's start with a question, actually. Obviously, when I ask this there's a lot of ways to answer this question, but in your mind, what is the purpose of education?
Well, the purpose of education should be, as it says in the word, to educate people, though on what is a great question, and how is an even better one.
Okay, so what comes to mind as some possible ways to consider? Like if you were an educator and someone asked you this question, how would you say this is the purpose of education? This is what it's for.
I would say it is for developing the minds of the future generations.
Okay, I actually love that. And I think that there's a lot of pieces here. But what I'm trying to get at ultimately is this idea that we need to provide education to people. We need to give people information, right?
Yes.
So this is why I approach it this way because I think fundamentally something changed around the turn of the millennium. This is pretty well understood, but we've moved into, I guess, what's being called the information age.
I think that's a good way to put it.
And I think that the distinct difference between the information age and all prior time has to do with the scarcity of information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What I mean is, prior to the information age, information was a scarce resource.
Most certainly.
But today, there's almost an abundance of information. And the issue is no longer about acquiring it so much as it is about sifting through it to find the relevant pieces of information.
Absolutely. Every day there's just new pieces of information. Like, the amount of stuff that is on the internet and being put into your brain every day is insane. I think it was something around the realm of 80,000 different, pieces of information you'll take in a day, which is absolutely mind-boggling to think about. And today, more so than ever, like you said, there is more and more new information coming out for you to take in.
Information overload, almost.
Oh, without a doubt. I think that, the human brain is only made to take in so much and comprehend so much. And there's going to be a point where it's just going to kind of be like, okay, I don't know how much of this I can actually retain so well.
Yeah, and this is something I think we'll get into for sure. So there's kind of two sections I'll break this into. There's education in early society and then education once we started to make it like publicly available, right?
Yeah. Those are, I think, the two easiest ways to break it down into.
So early education was much more kind of a tutor type experience. You would get like individual one-on-one education. And this was pretty much exclusive to people who had wealth.
Yeah, precisely. I mean, it was a thing which people would pay the highly intelligent to, help their kids with. They would just bring them into the house and have them teach skills or whatever to their kids.
Yeah, well, it's a privilege, right? It was one of those things where, it wasn't required. It was like if you had the money and you wanted your family to be educated, you would pay someone who had access to resources come and educate your children or whatever.
Yeah, and for the reason that it was hard to get that information. It was very scarce.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a big part of this, right? Even so, say before the printing press, you would literally have to deal with scribes transcribing books, and there's only a limited number of copies of them, and they're kept in certain places where only certain people are going to have access to them. Just very difficult to acquire that information, and then therefore we need people who have access to that to then pass it on to others. Then there's this stage where we realize, education should be accessible to the broader public.
Yeah, to the masses.
And we start looking into kind of now institutional education.
Yep, that idea that the government is going to provide you with your education as a sort of given.
Yeah, the state is meant to provide this as a service, right?
Yep.
And so the system that is basically still in use today was the Prussian education system is really what sparked this sort of movement. And the purpose of that, was to create, I mean, this is around the Industrial Revolution as well, right?
Yeah, it's very antiquated.
Sure. But what I'm going for is, at the time, we started to have a lot more necessity for skilled workers in factories, etc. And you needed some level of education, and therefore we need to create some institution to help fill those roles.
Yeah, it was created with the intent that you wanted to condition the workers to get used to having a very scheduled and rigid day, and to obey the lessons which they were being taught and not really question them that much.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a huge piece that we should talk more about as well. But I think you really hit the nail on the head in terms of the intent behind the structure there, right? So this is an important development, and I think there were a lot of benefits to the solution that they created. But obviously, as we come into the information age, there's a lot of problems as well. But I think we do need to acknowledge how important of a development it was and how beneficial it was to at least start getting education out to the masses.
For sure, not to take away from it, because it was incredibly beneficial to the entirety of humanity to have education being more well distributed, because it increased the overall intelligence of people, and it helped advance society greatly. You had more people who are more capable than they had ever been.
Totally. And I think it's easy today to look back and be like, oh yeah, absolutely, this system was designed to basically control people and keep them from asking questions and all this stuff. Like, it's easy to look at the flaws now because of where we are today, right?
Yeah, hindsight is 20/20, but when you're back then and you're designing the system, it's pretty perfect for what they were trying to achieve.
I think to hammer this point home, those systems were designed with the intent of getting information from the small number of people who had it to the larger number of people who didn't. This idea of scarcity, right? And this is where this notion of teaching is important. It's this idea that there are individuals who have this information and need to pass it on to others. And I think this has been the crux of education for as long as it's existed. And that's why it's so difficult to rethink this paradigm today.
Yeah, you sort of have to break the mold that was once existent, which is hard to do for a lot of people. You need an out-of-the-box thinker to try and get anywhere close to something different.
Yeah, I think it's such a subtle thing to realize as well. This idea that now, if it's not about individuals who have information and need to distribute it, we're really flipping the script. It's now literally all of this information is around us, and we need to figure out how to consume it. I'll give you some terminology that I've come up with to help me understand this stuff. I consider the old way the knowledge transfer model, where we have some, those who know distributing information to those who don't. So the alternative would be something like a knowledge acquisition model, something where we're no longer trying to distribute knowledge, but trying to
learn how to acquire it in the most
yeah,
efficient way.
exactly. So this is the other piece of terminology here that I see is that in a knowledge transfer model, it's very teacher centric.
Absolutely. The teacher holds the authority in the room.
As the person who is transferring the knowledge, they are the authority figure, sure.
Yep.
But in a knowledge acquisition model, it is definitively learner centric.
Yeah, you're catering to the learner. You're trying to figure out how they can get what they need to get.
Yes, exactly. And I've definitely heard people talking about learner centric models. This terminology has become more and more well known, especially in the last 20, 25 years or so, right?
Oh, absolutely. Taking ownership for your education, is like something that teachers will even tell me in school today. And it's kind of like interesting. But if I was to take ownership of my education, I feel like I just wouldn't want to learn what you're teaching me.
Okay, so we'll get into this stuff for sure. But the point I wanted to make was that learner centric is definitely the buzzword that I hear when people talk about revolutionizing education. But I think this misses some of the point, because I think that what I'm seeing is people liking this idea of learner centric models, but trying to shoehorn them into a knowledge transfer model.
Yeah, right, because that's the framework that everyone's so familiar with.
Yes. Yeah, precisely. We're still in knowledge transfer mode.
Yeah, the system hasn't been rethought or redesigned yet. People are still just trying to fit it into the old mold.
Yeah, I almost like the word framework you used. I think that's the kind of the right gist that I'm getting it at, is like we still haven't changed that basic framework to be a knowledge acquisition model. And that's where we've failed, because despite the fact that we realize we need a learner-centric model, we haven't fundamentally understood this idea that I'm talking about of information scarcity and now abundance, like why that changes the paradigm. Do you see my point?
Oh, absolutely. It's sort of just like, with construction. Buildings used to be made out of like a whole bunch of wood and there was no concrete, and that's what the old, education system is, and now we got to revolutionize this a little bit. We got steel, we have concrete, and we can build these things hundreds of stories up into the sky. But at some point, you have to realize how to build them up into the sky, and I think that's sort of what we're trying to get at here, isn't it?
Yeah, I think we're looking at a whole new paradigm. We have to absolutely shift the way we think about, again, the purpose of education. That's why I started with that question. Like, what are we trying to accomplish here? And I think that we're still in this mode of education is about delivering information to students, whereas this learner-centric model is much more about facilitating the learning process for individuals, as opposed to trying to like dump information on them and see how well they retain it.
Absolutely. Yeah, like trying to have someone retain all of this information that you teach them in a whatever it is, some close to an 8-hour day is not realistic. It's just one, inefficient, because if you're going to try and shove so much information down my throat during an 8-hour day, there's only so much of it that I'm really going to actually remember the next day. Two, it is not very fun to sit in a place and have this, like, what seems to be pointless stuff thrown at me and told to me that I need to, just remember it. It's sort of just demoralizing.
Yeah, I feel that 100%. And I think on top of that, the other piece is like, do you really need to memorize this stuff when that information is so accessible?
Right. I think that there's something here to the point of they're using this useless information to attempt to teach you the skills that we really just think should be taught in the first place.
This brings up a distinction that I like to make, because there's information and then there's knowledge. And what do you see as the difference? I'm curious.
Well, I think that there's almost a third piece, and I think there's wisdom as a third. I think wisdom is more of like that philosophical thinking. Information is sort of, it's like a statistic. Information is Luka Doncic is the first player in NBA history to average blah blah blah. But knowledge is, what can you do with that information? How do you know to apply it to different things?
Yeah, I think that's basically the distinction I'm making as well. And I do agree there are levels and you can use all kinds of words to describe. I think the point is more about how we apply versus like facts versus actual conclusions that we draw from these things.
Yeah, I think that's pretty good.
So knowledge I think is important. And that's what we really want to focus on, but school still seems very information centric where it's a lot more about like do you know this information? I'm not sure how relevant that question is anymore. I think it's much more about what kind of knowledge have we imparted or like if you have this sea of information, how effectively have you synthesized that information into valuable conclusions?
Right, exactly. I think that's what I was even trying to get at with saying they're trying to use this information to try and help you teach us these skills, right? Like they're trying to overload you with this abundance of information and trying to help you get knowledge out of it. Like we're going to throw these math formulas at you and then this is going to teach you how to think critically and problem solve.
Yeah, I think hopefully there's definitely some level of that. I think though we're still doing things like testing how well you can remember factual information, like historical events that took place on these dates or whatever, right?
Oh yeah, I've had those every year for the last like 2 or 3.
I'm just not sure how useful that is as a skill anymore. I think the whole point is yes, it's important to know that those things took place and have an approximate sense of when they were and what the context was, but being able to understand what the motivations were, what the lessons that we learned from those things, like this is the stuff that matters today because you can always go back and look up the details of whatever, this thing happened, when and why. There's a lot more you can do when you have the internet at your fingertips anywhere you go.
Yeah, you can't really learn about even say just the repercussions of an event from the internet so quickly, you know? Learning how it impacted the globe, the economy, cultures, people just as a whole is really hard to do. But, you can, like you said, whip out your phone and ask Siri how long the First World War lasted and, have that information in 5 seconds.
Yeah, I think this goes back to the point I was making about still being in this knowledge transfer mindset. We are trying to use tools that are more learner centric, but still in this knowledge transfer environment, rather than adjusting the framework to be geared towards helping learners acquire this information and know what to do with it.
Yeah, they're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, which isn't going to work very well. Like maybe it'll slide through in a sense, but it's not perfect.
And then I think another piece of this that we probably want to get into is now the use of things like AI.
Oh man, AI. At this point, I just know that teachers at my school condone the use of AI because there's no way for them to stop it.
I think that that's sort of similar to what happened with the internet in some regard.
Oh, there's no doubt. I think that at least now with AI, teachers are just like, yeah, use it to help you, but don't, have it write your essay. I don't know. How was that like for you with the internet?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was interesting because it opened up new research tools, right? It was things like, you've got to find good sources. You can't just use like Wikipedia or whatever.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's the same kind of analog. It's like, oh, you can't just have the thing write your whole essay for you, but you can use it to help strengthen your ideas or whatever else, right?
Yeah, it's sort of a at-home tutor that can teach you anything and everything.
Well, this is where I wanted to go with it is the ideal situation in education is to be able to have one-on-one tutoring for everyone, right?
Yeah.
There's no way that was going to happen prior to the invention of something like AI. You have too many students and not enough teachers, and therefore there's no way to actually facilitate one-on-one learning for everyone. But maybe today it is possible, or where it's getting close.
I think that it's becoming more and more of a thing for certain subjects. There's no doubt that in certain classes, teachers have begun to ask kids to use AI for their projects because it can teach them a lot of the lessons that the teacher may need to just give the kids from the jump. So in a sense, it saves them having to give the very baseline knowledge that most people won't acquire or get, or maybe a connection that the people won't make. Now, when the teacher is going around the classroom and people have questions, they can actually give their more critical and more thought out knowledge to the kid.
I think this really, just to hammer this point home again, it's like, I still think that we're using AI as a tool in this existing paradigm of, the knowledge transfer model. I think the real problem is that's not the best way to use AI as a tool in education. I think we need to have first rethought the paradigm and then try to figure out how AI can be used to assist the learner in their individual learning journey.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's what we've, like you said, been trying to get home this whole time. That it's not that the system is broken, because that one just implies that it can be fixed, but it's just, it functions upon the incorrect assumption.
Right. I think that's a very important point. Literally, the assumptions that the education paradigm that exists today is built on are no longer valid. And therefore, we need to completely rethink the whole institution.
Yeah, the whole machine needs to get not even a tune-up. It's just got to get a new version.
It's got to get an upgrade.
Yeah, man. Gotta add a couple more cylinders.
And I think that tools like AI would be extremely valuable in order to do this, because rather than teachers, we start to have facilitators where you have people who have gone through and learned a lot of these things and know where people will get tripped up, or can help people decide even what's worth spending their time on. And then those individuals can go and work and use tools like AI to help gather information, sift through, extract knowledge, all of these things, rather than trying to figure out a fixed curriculum that should be applied to all students in a cookie cutter mold.
Yeah, and it's even interesting because the information that you get in two different classes in the same subject will differ today in education. The education, regardless of how even and the same as they want to call it, it's really not. Not just because your teacher is different, but the material that they'll give you is different. The curriculum in itself is literally different. And it's just conflicting because it's hard to, even, we'll go to this, the idea of like a grading scale. Like, how does that even work? It's all subjective in certain subjects. So it really is just, it's hard.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are concepts that really only apply in a knowledge transfer model. I don't think that grading is even necessarily beneficial in a knowledge acquisition model in the same way that it is today. I think that you can still measure progress, and that's still valuable to do, but certainly it should be much more about measuring how, at an individual level, are you progressing? Incremental improvements of the individual. It's less about measuring your progress relative to others. It's more about your progress relative to yourself.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, I had a friend text me today and be like, I understand you. And I'm just like, wait, what is this kid talking about? And I'm like, what are you talking about? He's like, I was reading a book and I finally got why you say I'm a genius. And I'm like, oh, let's see where he goes with this. And it was like, the real thing is that you can't judge someone's intelligence off of how well they do in school. All of this knowledge that you gain and acquire yourself, which is where I almost want to kind of drive this discussion, is the important thing. How can you make conjecture and connections through the things that you've learned and you've taught yourself? That idea of the autodidactic spirit.
Yeah, that's obviously near and dear to my heart. I feel as though, okay, well, obviously, as someone with a visual impairment, the traditional education system was difficult for me to navigate. So
yeah,
even regardless of the flaws that I see in the system as a whole, for me, it was particularly difficult to deal with. So what ended up happening for me was that I took it upon myself to move my education forward, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that is, I think, a huge part of this learner-centric model is this idea of taking ownership of your education.
And you, I think, are a very good example of this. So what would you say is one of the best things that you did for your own ability to take responsibility of your education?
Yeah, well, I think for me, what started to happen was I started caring less and less about education as I moved through like middle school, and then the first year of high school, I was just kind of coasting along because I could tell that whatever we were doing in education was like not very helpful to me. And then in my sophomore year, suddenly I like found some passion for mathematics. And as a result of it turned out that what was cool is we actually had an online companion to our textbook that had like video lectures you could go and do on your own. So I went home and like started going through these lectures. And it ended up where I went through more and more of these even beyond the class that I was in. I was in like algebra 2 at the time or something, and I went
Mhm.
all the way through and did all the calculus videos too. I think I went through all of calculus in like a week. But I guess my point there is it became about what I was interested in. It became about what I was passionate about. And rather than worrying about the structure that was imposed on me, I started to be like, what matters? What do I care about? And then that carried me forward. So I started to do better in school generally just because I had something to care about, and it came from intrinsic motivation.
Well, before we round this off, you said something which I really thought was important, is you found something which you took passion in. And I think that's something that people will struggle a lot with, is finding what they want to learn about. Finding what they take, passion in. So, for you, how do you think you grew to love mathematics so much?
You know, it's an interesting question. It's a hard question to answer. I think there was something about that's just kind of how my brain works. So again, the visual impairment thing, I was obviously spent a lot more time like in my head than out in the world
Yep.
because, playing sports or whatever is also difficult. And so I spend a lot of time just thinking and working in the abstract. And mathematics, to be good at that stuff, you start having to recognize patterns and work with more abstract concepts. So I think it played nicely into the way that my brain evolved, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, I think that's just as even more of like a generalization. You'll begin to find out what you need to know by just learning about yourself. The more you begin to discover what you take passion in and what you find interest in and what you are best at, the more you're going to be able to find what you, hold up air quotes, need to know.
Yeah, so this is a huge point, actually. And I'm really glad that you're picking up on this and emphasizing it. In this world of a learner-centric model of knowledge acquisition, what's important is it becomes much more about you, the individual, and what matters to you. And that's what I'm trying to drive home is that we don't all need to learn the same things. We don't all need to learn at the same pace. We can do things in a way that is much more tailored to what your interests and abilities allow you and enable you to do.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
I also want to add a piece of this, which is for me, this same philosophy followed. So as soon as I started doing this stuff in mathematics, I ended up going more and more in this direction in terms of learning on my own, and actually brought me to come up with models for learning how to learn, what I called meta learning. And this, I think, is the most important skill for individuals today, is actually understanding how you learn in particular, because this goes back to what you said about knowing yourself, getting to understand what works for you.
Absolutely. I mean, education is more and more, I think, needing to become something which is very personal.
Individualized. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good word. Because as like we said at the start, there's so much information. There's only so much of it that really is applicable to you and useful to you. And being able to sift through it, like we said, and find what really will work for you is, I think, what education really is or should be there to do.
I think that this is true too. And I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that as artificial intelligence gets better and better, and machines start being able to do more and more of the cognitive labor that we do today, that humans do today, the necessity for these skills is going to change drastically. So we're going to have to figure out the stuff that we are individually best at, and try to focus our energy on getting good at those things and following the things that we're actually passionate about.
Yeah, following those passions. Well, we're getting close to time here. So is there anything else you'd like to say before we close it out?
Yeah, I've got one more thing. I think there's a key skill in this process of learning how to learn. And that I want to say is asking questions. Whenever I am doing something that involves learning a new skill, it always starts with asking a relevant question. And when I say relevant, I mean relevant to me. So going back to this individualization idea, I want to understand, how is this going to apply to me? Why is this particular skill relevant to what I'm trying to accomplish? And when you start with a good question, it starts to lead you on that path forward. So if you're looking for a place to start, I always say start by asking questions. And they don't have to be good questions, whatever it is, just ask anything, and it will at least put you on the path.
I remember that when you told me this for the first time, I was kind of just like, how well would this work if I just start asking questions about stuff that I'm curious about? And what I began to realize is that the more random questions that I would ask, the more directions I would go in, and the better questions that I would begin to ask because I had more context about what I needed to ask about.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's exactly it. And I think it's that curiosity. Maybe that goes back to answering your original question. It's like, how did I find that I was interested in XYZ? It's like just curiosity. I'm just a curious person about whatever it is that I'm curious about. And that is what led me to do these things. It's just being endlessly curious. I think that's a good place to wrap it up. I appreciate the conversation. It was a lot of fun.
Oh, it was an absolute pleasure, as it is every time.
Why don't you tell the people where to find us?
Well, if you guys want some more content before next week's episode, you can find us at The Wrong Idea on Instagram, TikTok, and X. And that's it for this week. We'll see you next time.
Got a thought that challenges the norm? We want to hear it. Post your wrong idea with the hashtag Wrong Idea. That's RONG Idea. And join the conversation. Who knows? Your perspective might just be featured in a future episode. Remember, in a world of endless perspectives, all ideas are wrong ideas. Until next time, keep thinking, keep challenging, and keep embracing the unconventional.